Imagine a grand theatre of existence where every life unfolds on an ever-changing stage. In this vast production, the power of values acts as the unseen director, guiding our actions and shaping our destinies. Visualize a scene where the lights not only illuminate, but also reveal the deep motivations of the human soul. On this captivating stage, we stand at the crossroads of dreams and reality, torn between the desire for greatness and the truth of our innermost being. The text you are holding, The Power of Values by Orison Swett Marden, is far more than a mere collection of wisdom. It is an ancient map, weathered by time, that reveals the secrets of true success and personal fulfillment. Each page serves as a compass, pointing us toward the heart of what it means to be human, toward the divine spark within each of us that has the power to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Throughout history, the men and women who left an indelible mark on the world were not merely those with extraordinary talents or vast wealth. No, their true power came from a much deeper, more enduring source, their values. These unseen pillars, forged in the fires of personal conviction and sacrifice, formed the foundation of their success, lighting their path through the darkest times. In The Power of Values, Marden invites us on a journey to discover how these fundamental principles serve as the invisible force driving every remarkable success and personal victory. With each chapter, we will delve into the inspiring stories of those who wielded their values as both a sword to cut through adversity and a shield to protect their dreams from life's challenges. So, dear reader, prepare to embark on a journey through the pages of this book, a journey that will not only uncover the secrets of great triumphs, but will also inspire you to discover and embrace the power of your own values. For in every decision, every challenge, and every triumph, it is the power of values that shapes who we are and who we have the potential to become. The triumphs of ordinary virtues. The talent for success is nothing more than doing what one can do well without thinking of glory. It's not about what a man knows, but how he uses what he knows. As G. Holland says, a diligent man in business will present himself before kings. The most encouraging truth to instill in the minds of youth is this: what one man has done, another man can do. Men who succeed should not be placed on pedestals and venerated as exceptions to humanity. On the contrary, these great men should be seen as models of success for all young aspirants. Their example shows what can be achieved through the practice of diligence, patience, thrift, determination, and perseverance. We can better appreciate the power of these simple virtues that anyone can cultivate and exercise by taking a concrete example of great success achieved through patience and perseverance toward a defined goal. There is no more illustrious example of success achieved through ordinary virtues than that of Abraham Lincoln. A railroad builder and president, Lincoln has probably been the hero of more American children over the past 2 generations than any other American figure. Young people see him as a wonderful being destined for a divine purpose. Yet upon analyzing his character, we find that it is composed of the humblest virtues and the most common qualities. The poorest children and youth who see him as a demigod possess these qualities. Lincoln's strength lay in his determination, frankness, and honesty. He was trustworthy. He had the ambition to bring out the best in himself, to learn more, to rise from mediocrity, and to play a meaningful role in the world. He simply desired to improve his condition. It is true that he had a divine thirst for growth, a passion for a larger and fuller life, but there is no evidence of great genius or marvelous power. He was a simple man who never sought recognition. His simplicity was his main charm. All who knew him considered him a generous and big-hearted friend, always ready to help anyone, whether it was a pig stuck in the mud, a poor widow in distress, or a farmer in need of advice. He had a helpful, open, frank, and transparent spirit. He hid nothing and had no secrets. The door to his heart was always open for anyone to read his innermost thoughts. The ability to perform hard work is the right hand of genius and its best substitute. Indeed, this is genius. If young people were to represent Lincoln's total success as a percentage, they would probably expect to find a brilliant faculty occupying at least 50% of the total. However, I believe history judges his honesty of intention, purity, and selfless motives as his highest attributes, and these qualities are within the reach of even the poorest and humblest youth in America. Let us suppose we evaluate his honesty and integrity at 20%, his tenacious perseverance and ability to work hard at 10%, his passion for completeness and accomplishment to the end at another 10%, and his aspiration and desire to grow and be complete in life with an additional 10%. The listener can see that it would be easy to complete 100% without finding any quality related to genius. The total of his character would consist of the sum of the most common qualities, the most ordinary virtues accessible to the poorest youth in the country. There is no quality in his entire character so dominant that it could be called genius. What an invaluable blessing for the world, what motivation, what inspiration for the poorest and youngest children that his success is attributed to the triumph of his personality, to those qualities that cannot be bought with money, glory, or influence, but which are accessible to the poorest and most needy. In a speech to the people of the Colorado Mountains, Roosevelt said, "You believe my success owes something that you cannot get. Let me assure you that the great prizes I have won are largely accidental. I have succeeded just as any of you can. I simply tried to fulfill my duty as I saw it in my home, in my business, and as a citizen. If, when I die, those who know me best believe that I have been a thoughtful and helpful husband, a loving, wise, and diligent father, a generous and kind neighbor, and an honest citizen, it will be a true honor, and it will prove that my life was more successful than having been President of the United States. If a few events that no one can control had been different from what they were, it is very possible that I would have never held the high office I now occupy. But no series of events could accidentally transform me into a noble character or a loyal member of my family and community. Therefore, each of you has the same opportunity to achieve the true success I have had, and if my success turns out to be as great as that achieved by many of the humblest of you, I will be fortunate. I did not have a great mental capacity. There was nothing surprising about my career. I was not a great genius, nor an outstanding scholar. I did not particularly distinguish myself in school. I was not a great lawyer, and I did not have a great record in Congress. But I had a balanced mind. I possessed the best substitute for genius, the ability to work hard and perseverance. I knew how to continue working hard, how to endure, and I knew that the only way to prove my worth in Congress was to focus on one subject and specialize in tariffs, following the advice of a statesman friend. The biographies of the greatest men in humanity are often discouraging for the average poor youth because when they feel the character they read about was a genius, the effect is largely lost on them, as they know they are not a genius. So it seems to them that the reading is very interesting and they will be able to do these things, but when they read McKinley's life, they see no reason why they couldn't do the same things, as there were no great leaps in his life. Starting from a particular skill or special opportunity. I didn't have exceptional talent, but I had a good average, common sense, and a hard-working nature. I had tact and diplomacy, and I made the best of every opportunity. No one can stop the success of one who has iron in their blood and is determined to succeed. When faced with obstacles, they overcome, traverse, or bypass them. Obstacles only serve to strengthen their spine, increase their determination, improve their ingenuity, and develop their innate resources. The history of human achievements is full of truths. There is no difficulty for one who wants to succeed. All the masterpieces of human art that we admire with astonishment and praise, says Johnson, are examples of the persistent force of perseverance. A man builds palaces with the same materials used to build slums, warehouses, or villas. Bricks and mortar are what they are until the architect transforms them into something else. The rock that was an obstacle on the path of the weak becomes a stepping stone on the path of the determined. The difficulties that discourage one man only serve to strengthen the nerves of another who sees them as a kind of mental springboard to leap over the chasm of failure to land safely and securely on the solid ground of total success. One of the greatest generals of the Confederate Army during the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson, was known for his slowness. However, he possessed great tenacious determination. If he undertook a task, he never abandoned it until it was finished. This is why, when he went to West Point, his usual response in class was that he was too busy with a previous lesson to focus on the one of the day. He remained steadfast, going from the least promising student to 17th out of 70, surpassing 53 students who had started with better results. His classmates said that if the course had lasted 10 years instead of 4, he would have been first in his class. The world always shifts to make room for the determined man. There is no royal road to triumph, no open door to the temple of success. One of the most common virtues is perseverance. However, it has been the key to many doors that would have remained closed to more brilliant opportunities. Anyone can develop this virtue of perseverance, avoid excessive ambition, and resist distractions that only complicate the process. The theme of perseverance in particularly difficult situations is one of the most fascinating in history. Constancy has been a characteristic of all the figures who have left their mark on the world. It is said that perseverance is the brain of the statesman, the sword of the warrior, the secret of the inventor, and the key of the scholar. Perseverance is to talent what steam is to the machine. It is the driving force that allows the machine to do the work for which it was designed. With a great deal of perseverance and little talent, one can go farther than with much talent and no perseverance. The success of a determined person cannot be dismissed. Take away their money and they will turn their poverty into motivation to move forward. Lock them in a prison and they will write the famous Pilgrim's Progress. Hold on to something and see it through to completion, and you will become a hero. You will have a higher opinion of yourself and others will praise you. Diligence is another common virtue that everyone can cultivate. The person who puts their best effort into every task will leave far behind the one who settles for doing the minimum. Nothing is good enough if it doesn't reflect the best of ourselves. Daniel Webster had no remarkable traits of character in his childhood. He was sent to Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, where he stayed for a short time. A neighbor found him crying on his way home and asked the reason. Daniel said that he sincerely wished to be a good student, but he was being mocked by the other children for always being at the bottom of the class, and he had decided to give up and go home. The friend told him to return and see what he could accomplish by studying diligently. Daniel returned to his studies with the determination to succeed, and it didn't take long before he silenced those who had mocked him, reaching and maintaining the top spot in his class. Loyalty to duty was a virtue that distinguished men who held positions of authority and command. It is known that in Napoleon's offices, the word glory resonated, while Wellington's offices revolved around the word duty. Nowadays, people seem reluctant to walk the difficult path of duty in order to be recognized and honored by the country with patience and perseverance. From time to time, I receive letters from young men who say that if they were sure they could become a Webster in law, they would devote all their energy to studying, pouring their entire lives into their work. Or if they could become an Edison in invention, a great leader in medicine, or a merchant prince like Wanamaker or Marshall Field, they would work with enthusiasm and determination, ready to make any sacrifice and go through any ordeal to achieve what those men accomplished. But many of them say that they don't feel within themselves the marvelous ability, the great genius, or the immense talent of those leaders, and that is why they are not ready to make a great effort. They don't realize that success doesn't necessarily consist of accomplishing something grand, but simply living each day with awareness and honesty. It is by practicing virtues, striving to see things through to the end, being truly honest in every transaction, being sincere with our friends, adopting a helpful and kind attitude toward those around us, and trying to be the best citizen possible, a good neighbor, a loving and encouraging father, that we achieve success. Success has no secret. It is simply the natural and persistent exercise of the most common daily qualities. We have seen people in the fields in summer crushing daisies and beautiful violets, magnificent wildflowers, in their efforts to obtain a branch of showy flowers from a large tree, which perhaps wouldn't even compare in beauty and delicacy to the ones they crushed in trying to reach it. How many exquisite experiences, how many potential joys have been crushed by our desire to obtain something grand in trying to achieve something wonderful that would attract attention and make our names appear in the newspapers. We crush the subtlest emotions. We spoil many of life's most delicate things in our panic to get something unusual, something showy that we can wave in front of the world to gain its praise. In the effort to achieve an effect, in the struggle to accomplish something grand and wonderful, we lose the small successes whose sum would have made our lives sublime. And often, after all this effort and struggle for the grandest things, we lose them. And then we discover with astonishment what we lost along the way, how much sweetness, how much beauty, how many comforting and domestic things we lost in that unnecessary struggle. Great scientists tell us that the reason why the secrets of nature remained hidden from the world for so long is that we are not simple enough in our reasoning methods. Researchers are always looking for unusual phenomena, something complicated, while the principles of nature's secrets are so extremely simple that men ignore them in their efforts to see and solve the most complex problems. It is very unfortunate that so many young people feel that success consists of accomplishing something wonderful and must become geniuses to achieve it. Otherwise, they could not accomplish such remarkable things. "How is young Davis doing?" asked Farmer John Field, observing his son Marshall attending to a customer. "Well, John, you and I are old friends," replied Deacon Davis, taking an apple from a barrel and handing it to Marshall's father as a gesture of peace. "I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm a straightforward man, and I'll tell you the truth. Marshall is a good boy, but he would never be a merchant even if he stayed 1,000 years in my shop. He is not cut out to be a merchant. Take him to the farm, John, and teach him to milk the cows." If Marshall had continued as an employee in Deacon Davis's store in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where he got his first job, he would never have become one of the greatest merchants in the world. However, when he went to Chicago and saw wonderful examples of poor young people who had achieved success, it awakened his ambition. With great determination, he decided to become a great merchant himself. If others can accomplish such wonderful things, he asked himself, why not me? Of course, Mr. Field was destined to become a great merchant from the start, but circumstances and a stimulating environment contributed greatly to awakening his latent energy and revealing his reserve strength. It would have been strange to see him rise so quickly elsewhere other than in Chicago. In 1856, when the young Field arrived in this wonderful city, it was beginning its unmatched journey. At that time, it had only about 85,000 inhabitants. A few years earlier, it was just a small Indian trading village, but the city was growing rapidly and always surpassing the expectations of its most optimistic inhabitants. Success was in the air. Everyone believed that great possibilities existed there. Many people seem to think that ambition is an innate quality that cannot be improved, that it is something imposed upon us and will maintain itself on its own. In reality, it is a passion that responds very quickly to attention, because it requires constant care and practice, just like a talent for music or art. Otherwise, it atrophies. If we do not try to realize our ambition, it will become less and less clear and defined, and our faculties will dull and quickly lose their power if they are not exercised. How can we expect our ambition to remain vivid and vigorous during years of inactivity or indifference if we constantly let opportunities pass by without trying to seize them? Our ambition will continue to dull and weaken. What we need most, as Emerson says, is someone who motivates us to do what we can do. That is the problem, not what a Napoleon or a Lincoln might be, but what I can do myself. That makes all the difference. Whether I draw the best or worst from myself, whether I use 10%, 15%, 25%, or 90% of my ability, that is what matters. Everywhere, we see people who have reached adulthood without awakening. They have only developed a small percentage of their potential for success. When we meet these people, we are aware that they possess a great latent power, never exercised, and great possibilities of usefulness and accomplishment that are unconsciously wasted within them. Some time ago, a newspaper article told the story of a young girl who, at the age of 15, had only developed the mental level of a child. Only a few things interested her. She was dreamy, inactive, and indifferent to everything around her most of the time. Then one day, while listening to a piano in the street, she suddenly awakened to full consciousness. Her faculties were aroused, and in a few days, she made a leap of several years in her development, almost overnight going from childhood to adulthood. Most of us possess an immense amount of latent power, sleeping within us, as it was in that young girl, which could work wonders if we awakened it. The judge of the municipal court in a flourishing western city, one of the most respected in his state, was an illiterate blacksmith in his middle age. Now, 60 years old, he owns the best library in the city, is reputed to be the most cultured man, and his greatest effort is to help others. What revolutionized his life? Attending a lecture on the value of education. It awakened a dormant strength in him, stimulated his ambition, and set him on the path of self-development. I have known several men who did not realize their potential until adulthood. Then, they suddenly woke up as if from a long sleep by reading an inspiring book, listening to a sermon or lecture, or meeting a friend, someone with high ideals who understood them, believed in them and encouraged them. For you, it will make all the difference in the world if you are surrounded by people who observe your abilities, believe in you, motivate you and praise you. Or if you are with those who constantly mock your ideals, undermine your hopes and dampen your aspirations. The head of the parole board for the juvenile court in New York in his 1905 report states that removing a child from an inappropriate environment is the first step toward their rehabilitation. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, after 30 years of investigating the social and moral welfare of over 500,000 children, also concluded that environment is more powerful than heredity. Even the strongest among us is not immune to their environment. No matter how independent, strong, and determined our nature may be, our environment constantly changes us. Let's take the best of children, those with the best hereditary conditions, and raise them among savages. How many of their inherited tendencies will remain? It is clear that if a person is raised in a barbaric and violent environment from childhood, they will eventually become a violent person. There is a story of a child who, lost or abandoned as a baby, or nursed by a wolf with her own pups, actually adopted all the characteristics of the wolf. He walked on all fours, howled like a wolf, and ate like one. It does not take much to predict the future of most of us. We naturally follow the examples around us, and, as a general rule, we rise or fall according to the strongest current in which we live. The poet's phrase, "I am part of everything I have known," is not a mere poetic fancy but an absolute truth. Every sermon, lecture, or conversation you have heard, every person who has touched your life has left an imprint on your character, and you are never the same person after experiencing them. You are a little different from what you were before, just as the man was never the same after reading Racine. A few years ago, a Russian shipbuilding company sent a group of Russian workers to the United States to acquire American methods and spirit. Within 6 months, the Russians had almost become the American craftsmen with whom they worked. They had developed ambition, individuality, personal initiative, and a marked degree of excellence in their work. A year after their return to their own country, the dreary and non-progressive atmosphere that surrounded them had taken its toll. The men had lost the desire to improve. They were becoming demotivated workers again with no goal beyond daily work. The ambition awakened by a stimulating environment had once again fallen asleep. Our Indian schools sometimes publish side-by-side photographs of young Indians, as they are when they leave the reservation and as they appear when they graduate, well-dressed, intelligent, with the fire of ambition in their eyes. We predict great things for them, but most of those who return to their tribes, after struggling for a time to maintain their new level, gradually revert to their old way of life. Of course, there are many notable exceptions, but these are strong characters capable of resisting the temptation to give up. If you ask the many who have failed, you will find that many failed because they were never in an environment that stimulated and encouraged them, because their ambition was never awakened, or because they were not strong enough to recover from depressing environments. Most of the people we find in prisons and poorhouses are lamentable examples of how a negative environment awakened the worst in them, rather than fostering the best. Whatever you do in life, make all the necessary sacrifices to keep yourself in an environment that awakens your ambition, an environment that motivates you toward personal development. Stay close to people who understand you, who believe in you, who help you discover yourself and motivate you to bring out the best in yourself. This can make the difference between great success and a mediocre existence. Surround yourself with those who are trying to accomplish something and be someone in the world, with those who have great goals and ambitions. You will be influenced by the spirit that dominates your environment. The success of those who are trying to rise around you will stimulate and encourage you to struggle more ardently. There is great strength in a group of people working together toward high goals, a powerful magnet that will help you reach your ambitions. It is very stimulating to be with people whose aspirations are parallel to yours. If you lack energy, if you are lazy by nature, or if you tend to take things passively, you will be pushed forward by the constant momentum of the more ambitious. The man with an idea, the one who wants to accomplish his mission, must be a man of one idea, that is, of one great overriding goal that overshadows all other goals and guides and controls his whole life. The healthy hunger for a great idea is the beauty and blessing of life. A deep conviction lifts a man above the fear of ridicule. Stuart said, Ideas resonate in the world louder than cannons. Thoughts are more powerful than armies. Principles have won more victories than cavalry or chariots. Why bother with a knitting machine? Asked Ari Davis from Boston, an instrument manufacturer. Why don't they make a machine? They had consulted a wealthy man and an inventor who had reached the limits of their ingenuity in the vain attempt to create a device for knitting woolen items. I wish I could, but it is impossible. Oh yes, it's possible, said Davis. I can make one myself. Well, replied the capitalist, make it yourself and I will assure you a fortune. Davis's words were spoken jokingly, but the innovative idea took root in the mind of one of the workers present, a 20-year-old man who was thought incapable of having a serious idea. But Elias Howe was not as foolish as he seemed, and the more he thought about it, the more the machine seemed desirable. 4 years later, with a wife and 3 children to support in a large city on a $9 a week salary, the cheerful young man had become a thoughtful and hard-working man. The idea of the sewing machine haunted him day and night, and he finally decided to make it after months of trying to work with a needle pointed at both ends, with an eye in the center, which was supposed to go up and down through the fabric. Suddenly, the idea came to him that other sewing stitches must be possible, and with almost obsessive devotion, he worked day and night until he created a rough model in wood and wire, which convinced him of the eventual success of his invention. In his mind, he saw his creation, but his own funds and those of his father, who had helped him somewhat, were insufficient to make it into a functional machine. However, help came from an old schoolmate, George Fisher, a coal and wood merchant from Cambridge, who agreed to house Elias and his family and contribute $500 in exchange for half the patent if the machine turned out to be worth patenting. By May 1845, the machine was finished, and by July, Elias had sewn the seams of 2 woolen suits, one for Mr. Fisher and one for himself. The seams lasted longer than the fabric. This machine, which still sews 300 stitches per minute and is considered almost perfect, is the model for many essential principles of the modern sewing machine. When it was decided to lift Chicago from its deadlock by raising its huge blocks to the level of the ground, the young son of a poor mechanic named George Pullman appeared and made an offer for the large project, and the contract was awarded to him. Not only did he lift the blocks, but he did so in a way that business inside was barely interrupted. During all this time, he was thinking about his favorite project, to build a sleeping car that would be adopted by all the railroads, equipped with berths. He had 2 old cars from the Chicago and Alton Railroad, and quickly realized that they would be in demand. So he went to work, assuming that the more luxurious his cars were, the more they would be wanted. After spending 3 years in the gold mines of Colorado, he returned and built 2 cars that cost $18,000 each. Everyone mocked Pullman for his madness, but he believed that anything that alleviated the boredom of long journeys would find quick approval and had enough faith in his idea to risk everything he had. Pullman firmly believed in the commercial value of beauty. The wonderful town he built, which bears his name, as well as his magnificent cars, are an example of his belief in this principle. He considered it wise to surround his employees with amenities, beauty, and good sanitary conditions, which made Pullman a model city of cleanliness, order, and comfort. The man with an idea who puts it into practice is the one who changes the face of the world. The first idea for the steam engine can be found in the writings of Greek philosophers, but it did not develop for more than 2,000 years. It was an English blacksmith, Newcomen, without opportunities, who in the 17th century conceived the idea of making a piston move by the elastic force of steam, but his machine consumed 13 pounds of coal to produce 1 horsepower. The perfection of the modern engine is largely due to James Watt, a poor, uneducated young Scotsman who at 15 wandered the streets of London looking for work. A professor at the University of Glasgow gave him a room to work in, and while he waited for a job, he experimented with old pots as steam reservoirs and hollow pipes as conduits. Unable to bear losing a moment, he improved Newcomen's machine by cutting off the steam after the piston had completed a quarter or a third of its stroke, allowing the steam already in the chamber to expand and push the piston for the remaining distance, saving almost 3/4 of the steam. He suffered extreme poverty and hardships that would have discouraged ordinary men, but he was very serious, and his courageous wife, Margaret, urged him not to be discouraged by the obstacles or disheartened if the engine did not work. She wrote to him as he struggled in London. "Do not despair. Something will happen eventually." One Saturday afternoon, Watt said, "I was out for a walk and passed by an old wash house, thinking about the machine, when the idea occurred to me that since steam is an elastic body, it would rush into the vacuum and could condense there without cooling the cylinder. The idea was simple, but it contained the seed of the first practical and valuable steam engine." Sir James Mackintosh considers this poor young Scotsman, who started alone with an idea, as the leader among all inventors of all times and nations. Look at George Stephenson working in the coal pits for 6 pence a day, mending clothes and repairing his colleagues' boots in the evenings to earn a little money to attend a night school, giving $150 of his earnings to his blind father to pay off his debts. People said he was crazy. His noisy steam engine would set houses on fire with its sparks, the smoke would pollute the air, and carriage makers and coachmen would starve from lack of work. For 3 days, the House of Commons committee asked him questions. One was, if a cow stands in the way of a locomotive travelling at 16 kilometres per hour, won't that be an uncomfortable situation? Yes, indeed, very uncomfortable for the cow, replied Stephenson. A government inspector claimed that if a locomotive reached that speed, he would promise himself a breakfast with a locomotive stew. What could be more absurd and ridiculous than the prospect of locomotives travelling twice as fast as horses? Wondered a writer in the Quarterly Review of March 1825. It is just as unlikely that the inhabitants of Wildwich will trust a high-speed machine as they would trust a rocket-launching machine with a net. We hope that Parliament will limit the speed on all railways to a maximum of 12 or 13 kilometres per hour, with which we are totally in agreement with Mr. Sylvester. This article referred to Stephenson's proposal to use his newly invented locomotive instead of horses on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, then under construction. The company decided to submit the matter to 2 leading English engineers, who reported that steam would only be practical for stationary locomotives, separated by 1.5 miles, pulling wagons using ropes and pulleys. But Stephenson managed to convince them to test his idea by offering a prize of $2,500 for the best locomotive produced in a trial scheduled for October 6, 1829. On that day, thousands of spectators gathered to witness the competition between 4 engines: the Novelty, the Rocket, the Perseverance, and the Sans-Péril. The Perseverance could only reach 9 kilometers per hour, disqualifying it, as the conditions required at least 16 kilometers per hour. The Sans-Péril reached an average of 22 kilometers per hour, but as a pipe broke, it lost its chance. The Novelty worked splendidly, but it also exploded a pipe and was eliminated, leaving the Rocket to claim the victory with an average speed of 40 kilometers per hour. It was Stephenson's locomotive, and he firmly proved his theory, causing the idea of fixed locomotives on a railway to be completely dismissed. He had taken the stationary engines designed by Wood's genius and put them on wheels to mobilize men and goods, defying the most pessimistic predictions of the leading engineers of his time. In all stories of inventions, there is no sadder or more moving tale than that of John Fitch. He was poor in many ways. He was born, lived, and died poor. If there was ever a true inventor, it was this man. He was one of those desperate souls willing to make any sacrifice to achieve his goal. One day, in the midst of a crisis with his project, he declared that if he could obtain £100 by cutting off a leg, he would not hesitate to do it. He unsuccessfully tried, both in his own country and in France, to raise funds to build his steamboat. He said, "You and I won't live to see this day, but there will come a time when the steamboat will be preferred to all other means of transport. When steamboats ascended the western rivers from New Orleans to Wheeling and crossed the ocean, Johnny Fitch would be forgotten, but other men would realize his ideas and become rich and famous because of them. Poor, ragged, desperate, ridiculed and considered a fool, rejected by the rich, he persevered until in 1790 he had the first boat on the Delaware that met the criteria for a steamboat. It traveled at 10 kilometers per hour against the current and 12 kilometers with it. On Friday, August 4th, 1807, at noon, a crowd of curious people gathered on the banks of the Hudson River. They had come to witness what they considered a ridiculous failure of a madman who proposed to transport a group of people upstream on the Hudson River to Albany aboard a steamboat called Clermont. "Have you ever heard of such a ridiculous idea as going upstream on the Hudson in a boat without sails? It will explode," said one. "It will burn. said another. "And everyone will drown," exclaimed a third. Seeing a large cloud of black smoke with a rain of bright sparks, probably none of the onlookers had ever heard of a steamboat. Everyone thought a man who had wasted his money and time on the Clermont was little better than an idiot and should be in an asylum. However, the passengers boarded. The plank was launched and the steam was lit. The beam moved slowly up and down and the Clermont floated on the river. "It will never make it upstream," insisted the spectators, but it did, and the young man who, in his youth, said there was nothing impossible, had achieved a great triumph and had given the world the first steamboat of great value. Despite the great service Fulton had rendered to humanity, a service that revolutionized global commerce, many considered him a public enemy. Critics and cynics judged and scorned Fulton whenever he was mentioned. The degree of censure, ridicule, and criticism that the world inflicts on a person is generally proportional to the benefit the victim has brought to humanity. As the Clermont burned pine wood, with columns of fire and smoke pouring from its chimney, moving triumphantly upstream, the people on the banks rushed to the shore, astonished to see a burning boat move so quickly against the current without oars or sails. The noise of its great paddle wheels increased the wonder. Sailors abandoned their boats, and fishermen rowed home as fast as they could to get away from the fire monster. The Indians were as scared as their predecessors had been when the first boat approached their territory on Manhattan Island. The owners of sailing boats were jealous of the Clermont and tried to sink it. Others, whose interests were affected, opposed Fulton claiming the invention and filed complaints against him. But the success of the Clermont quickly led to the construction of other steamboats across the country. The government hired Fulton to help build a powerful steam frigate called Fulton First. He also built a submersible boat for the government to launch torpedoes. By then, his reputation had spread throughout the civilized world, and at his death in 1815, the newspapers were marked with black lines. The New York Legislative Assembly wore mourning badges, and cannons fired salutes when the long funeral procession passed the old Trinity Cemetery. Very few people have been honored with such a solemn burial. It is true that Dr. Lerner had proven to scientists that a steamboat could not cross the Atlantic, but in 1810, the Savannah, coming from New York, appeared off the Irish coast, sailing under both sail and steam. After making this impossible crossing, those on land thought a fire had broken out under the bridge and sent a royal cutter to rescue it. Although the voyage had gone without incident, it took almost 20 years before it was admitted that steam navigation could succeed commercially in ocean traffic. While Junior Smith was restlessly walking on the deck of a ship traveling from an English port to New York during a difficult and tedious journey in 1832, he thought to himself, "Why not cross the ocean with steamships?" In New York and London, such an idea was dismissed as absurd. The first encouragement for Smith came from George Growth, a historian and banker, who said the idea was feasible, but it was still the same story. He wasn't willing to risk his money. Eventually, Isaac Selby, an important businessman in London, agreed to build a 2,000-ton steamship, the British Queen. An unexpected delay in installing the engines led the project promoters to charter the Sirius, a 700-ton river steamship, and send it to New York. Learning of this, others left Bristol 4 days later aboard the Great Western, and the two ships arrived in New York on the same day. Shortly afterwards, Smith made the round trip between London and New York in 32 days. What admirable determination and patience in Charles Goodyear in New Haven, buried in poverty and struggling with difficulties for 11 long years to make Indian rubber practically useful. See him in debtor's prison, pledging his clothes and his wife's jewelry to get some money to prevent his children, forced to gather branches from fields to make fire, from starving to death. Observe his immense courage and dedication to his idea when he couldn't afford to bury one of his children, and when his 5 other children were on the brink of starvation, despite harsh criticism from his neighbors for neglecting his family and accusations of madness. Yet despite everything, we have his vulcanized rubber, the fruit of this heroic struggle, applied to more than 500 uses by 100,000 employees. What a pathetic image of Palissy, desperately trying to rediscover the lost art of enameled ceramics, building his kilns with bricks carried on his back, watching his 6 children die, probably of hunger, his wife in rags and desperate due to her husband's madness, scorned by his neighbors for neglecting his family, reduced to a skeleton, giving his clothes to his worker because he couldn't pay him in money, always waiting and constantly failing until his great work was finally completed and he reaped its rewards. The idea of German unity was deeply rooted in Bismarck's heart. This Herculean despot mocked the chosen regime year after year simply to vote against every measure proposed. Indifferent to all opposition, he defied and dismissed every regime that stood against him. He could play alone, make Germany the greatest power in Europe, and make Wilhelm of Prussia a more powerful potentate than Napoleon or Alexander. Such was his most ambitious goal. It didn't matter what stood in his way, whether peoples, governments, or nations. Everything had to submit to his powerful will. Germany was to have the decisive voice in the concert of nations. He crushed everything and everyone in his path, defying opposition imperiously and repressing it. See the great Dante in exile, condemned to be burned alive for false charges of misappropriating funds. Despite his appearance as a gaunt vagabond, he never abandoned his idea. He invested his whole soul into his immortal poem, always believing that one day he would triumph. Columbus was exposed to continuous ridicule and indignation. He was mocked as a simple dreamer and stigmatized as an adventurer. It is said that children themselves would mock him, pointing at him as he passed by, as they had been taught to consider him a fool. Once, an American was invited to dinner by the famous German naturalist, and to his great surprise, he found neither meat nor dessert, only baked potatoes. The naturalist, far from being too proud to apologize for the simplicity of the meal, explained that her husband's income was very low, and they preferred to live humbly to acquire books and instruments for his scientific research. Before the discovery of ether, it sometimes took a week, and in some cases a month, to recover from a huge dose, sometimes 500 drops of laudanum, given to a patient to alleviate pain during surgery. The young Dr. Morton believed there must be a natural way to relieve human suffering during these terrible operations. But what could he do? He wasn't a chemist, didn't know the properties of chemicals, and had little education. However, Dr. Morton did not turn to books or scholars' advice, but began experimenting with well-known substances. He tested drugs until intoxicated, but as soon as the instruments were applied, the patient revived. He continued experimenting with narcotics until he finally found what he was looking for with ether. What a great idea the Bishop Vincent had for the young world in the Chautauqua Circle, Dr. Clark in his Global Christian Movement, the Methodist Church in the Edworth League, Edward Everett Hale in his small bands of Daughters of the King, and 10 times 10, that's 100. Here's Clara Barton, who founded the Red Cross, beloved by all nations. She noticed during our Civil War that the Confederates were bombarding the hospital. She thought it was the height of cruelty to fight against those who could not defend themselves and decided to end this barbaric custom. Of course, the world mocked this poor woman, but her idea was adopted by all nations. And the enemy who fired on a tent or building, flying the white flag with a red cross, lost all right to be treated with human consideration. Throughout history, those who have advanced the cause of humanity have been men and women possessed, as their neighbors considered them, just like other great men. Noah building the ark, Moses embracing the cause of the Israelites, or Christ dying to save a race, were despised by those with wealth and high education. However, at all times and in all situations, men and women have been willing to cross poverty, difficulties, hard work, ridicule, persecution, or even death, to try to illuminate or console the path that everyone must walk from birth to the grave. Indeed, it is doubtful that a man can render a great service to humanity if he is not imbued with a great purpose, a prevailing idea. Bismarck had to fight at every stage of his triumph through obstacles that would have horrified all but the greatest figures. Often in these great battles for principles and truth, he fought alone against popular prejudice, fanaticism, lack of charity and jealousy, even from his own church. But he did not waver or weaken in the face of his duty. He did not hesitate, did not seek a middle ground between good and evil, did not compromise on his principles, followed the line drawn and remained faithful to the truth. He never sought the favor of the public nor applause. His goal was duty and truth, and he aimed right. Other churches did not agree with him or his followers, but he was too generous for hatred, too charitable for vengeance, and too noble for envy. What tale from the Arabian Nights could match the fascination of the lives of Franklin, Morse, Goodyear, Edison, Bell, Gould, Harriet, Bischoff, Stone, Amos Lawrence, George Peabody, Howe, and dozens of others, each representing a great idea in action that improves the physical and moral conditions of those around them. There are still many ideas to be discovered in the world. Not everything has been invented, and not all good things have been realized yet. There are thousands of injustices that must be rectified, and each one challenges people with a new idea. But how to get ideas? Keep your mind open, observe, study, but most of all, think. And when a noble vision is indelibly etched in your mind, act boldly. The Spartans did not ask how many enemies there were, but where they were. Act with courage and nobility as the Romans did, and make death proud to take us. Shakespeare said, "Let me die facing the enemy. Ballard, who conquers me, will find a stubborn enemy." Byron said, "No great feat is accomplished by hesitants who ask for certainty." George Eliot said, "Fortune becomes a friend to the bold." Dryden added, "Standing tall with a smile on your face in front of a gallows from which you cannot escape is undoubtedly heroic. But true glory is resignation in the face of the inevitable, standing free of chains, totally free, submitted only to the higher demands of duty, and letting the fire consume until the heart. That is heroism." W. Robertson said, "Everyone must die where they are," said Colin Campbell to the 93 Highlanders at Balaclava when an overwhelming Russian cavalry force rushed toward them. "Collins, we shall do it," was the response from the men, many of whom were to obey his words. "Bring back the colours," cried a captain during the Battle of the Soule, when a second lieutenant held his position at the front, even though the men were retreating. "Don't shout, second lieutenant, show the men the colours. Dare, dare again without end, dare," was Danton's noble challenge to France's enemies. "The communes of France have decided to free," said Mira, seeing de Brézé bringing an order from the king to disperse on June 23, 1789. "We have heard the intentions attributed to the king and you, sir, who cannot be recognized as his representative at the National Assembly. You who have no place, no voice, no right to speak, you are not the person to bring us his message. Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the power of the people, and that we will leave only by the power of the bayonet." When the Senate of Rome asked Regulus not to return to Carthage to fulfill an illegal promise, he calmly replied, "They have decided to dishonor me. I am expected to torture and die. But what does that matter compared to the shame of a vile act or the scars of a guilty conscience? As much a slave to Carthage as I may be, I still retain the spirit of a Roman. I swore to return. Let the gods take care of the rest." The courage Cranmer had shown since the Ascension of Mary was demonstrated when his final condemnation was announced. The moral cowardice he had shown in his miserable conformity with the lust and despotism of Henry VIII reappeared in 6 successive retractations with which he hoped to obtain forgiveness. But forgiveness was impossible, and the complex nature of Cranmer found strength in his own weakness when he was brought to the Church of St. Mary at Oxford on March 21st to repeat his retraction on the way to the stake. Now, he finished his speech before the silent congregation. "Here is the great thing that troubles my conscience more than anything else I have said or done in my life, and that is the publication of writings that go against the truth. I renounce and reject these writings as the product of a hand that did not reflect the truth I had in my heart, written out of fear of death if I could save my life. And since my hand has offended in writing against my heart, my hand will be punished first. For if one day I must die at the stake, it will be the first to suffer," he exclaimed again on the stake. "Therefore it shall undergo the first punishment." And holding his hand firmly in the flames, he neither moved nor cried until life left him. A heartbreaking cry from a woman suddenly startled a group of surveyors dining in a forest in northern Virginia on a calm, sunny day in 1750. The cries continued, and the men made their way through the brush to discover where they came from. "Oh, Lord," the woman cried upon seeing a young man, 18 years old, of good stature and confident demeanor. "Do something for me. Free these people. My son. My poor son is drowning, and they won't let me go. It would be madness. I want to jump into the river." One of the men who was holding her back replied, "The violent currents will tear you apart in an instant." Removing his coat, the young man jumped to the edge of the river, surveyed the rocks and swirling currents for a moment. Then, spotting part of the boy's clothes, he plunged into the roaring currents. "Thank God, he will save my son," the mother cried, and everyone rushed to the edge of the precipice. There, oh my child, my dear child, how could I have left you?" However, all eyes were on the young man fighting with strength and hope amid the dizzying waves of swirling currents. It seemed as though he was about to crash against a jutting rock on which the water splashed into foam, and soon after a whirlpool would drag him away, the force of which seemed impossible to escape. The boy disappeared from view twice but reappeared the second time. Although near the most dangerous parts of the river, the current was terrible, and no one had dared approach even by canoe for fear of being shredded. The young man redoubled his efforts. 3 times he was about to catch the child when a stronger whirlpool threw him far away. He made one final effort. The child was supported by his strong right arm, but a scream of horror was already on everyone's lips when the child and the man were thrown by the falls and disappeared into the boiling waters below. "There they are," the mother cried a moment later in a delirium of joy. "Look, they are safe, thank God." And indeed they emerged unscathed from the fiery whirlpool and within minutes reached a lower spot on the shore where their friends helped them up. The boy was unconscious but still alive, and the young man, exhausted, heard the woman say, full of gratitude, "God will reward you. He will do great things for you in return for what you did today, and the blessings of thousands of people besides mine will be with you." The young man was George Washington. "You have the center of underdeveloped animal courage," said a phrenologist examining Wellington's head. "You are right," replied the Iron Duke, "and without my sense of duty, I would have withdrawn after my first battle." This first battle on an Indian field was one of the most terrible known. When General Jackson was a judge and holding a hearing in a small establishment, a frontier bandit, also a murderer and outlaw, entered the room with violent brutality and interrupted the trial. The judge ordered his arrest. The officer dared not approach him. "Call a squad," said the judge, "and arrest him." But they too trembled in fear before the bandit. "Call me then," said Jackson. He suspended the session for 5 minutes, left the courtroom, went straight toward the man, and with his piercing gaze intimidated the bandit who dropped his weapons, later saying, "There was something in his gaze that I couldn't stand." One of the last official acts of President Carnot of France was the sending of a Legion of Honor medal to a young American girl living in Indiana, while a Land 100 train with several distinguished Frenchmen aboard was heading to Chicago and the World's Fair. Jenny Carey, then 10 years old, discovered that scaffolding was on fire, and that if the incoming train entered it, there would be a terrible disaster. She ran along the tracks to a spot where she could be seen from afar, removed her red flannel skirt, and when the train was in sight, waved it from side to side. She was seen, and the train stopped. There were 700 people aboard, many of whom would have perished without Jenny's courage and determination. Upon her return to France, the French informed President Carnot of the incident, and the result was the sending of the medal from this famous French society, whose goal is to honor courage and merit wherever they are found. It was the heroic devotion of a little Indian girl that saved Captain John Smith's life when the powerful King Powhatan had decreed his death. The struggling colony could not afford to lose him at this critical time. On May 10, 1796, Napoleon took the bridge at Lodi against Austrian troops. 14 cannons, some say 30, aimed at the structure from the French side. Behind them stood 6,000 soldiers. Napoleon concentrated 4,000 grenadiers at the end of the bridge, with a battalion of 300 carabiniers in front. At the signal of the drum, the first assailants emerged from the wall under a terrible rain of grenades and projectiles. Attempting to cross the bridge's entrance, the front ranks fell like stalks under a scythe. The column staggered and retreated, and the brave grenadiers were horrified by the task ahead of them. Without a word or a reproachful glance, Napoleon positioned himself at their head, and his aides and generals ran alongside him. They advanced once more, this time over the heaps of dead that blocked the way, and in a rapid march timed by seconds. The column crossed the 200 meters of open space, with hardly a shot from the Austrians having any effect. Beyond the point where the platoons turned for the first leap, everything was so sudden and miraculous that the Austrian gunners immediately abandoned their cannons. Instead of rushing forward and fighting the French force, their reinforcements fled in panic. Napoleon had counted on this for his bold attack. The contrast between Napoleon's slender silhouette and the enormous grenadiers suggested the nickname of Little Corporal. When Esteban de Corona fell into the hands of vile assailants, they mockingly asked him, "Where is your fortress now?" "Here," was Saudas's response, as he placed his hand on his heart. After the Mexican War, General McLean worked as a topographical engineer studying the Pacific coastlines. From his headquarters in Vancouver, he had gone on an exploratory expedition with 2 companions, a soldier and a servant, when one night he received word that the chiefs of the Columbia tribes wished to meet him. Based on the messenger's manner, he suspected that the Indians intended to harm him, and he warned his companions to be ready to leave the camp at any moment. He mounted his horse and boldly entered the Indian village. About 30 chiefs were holding a council. McLean was led into the circle and placed at the right of Saltese. He was familiar with Chinook jargon and could understand every word spoken in the council. Saltese outlined the tribe's complaints. The Indians had been captured by a group of white pioneers and hanged for theft. Retribution seemed inevitable. The chiefs thought for a long time but had little to say. McLean had maintained friendly relations with them and was not responsible for the executions in the forest, but he was still a white man, and the chiefs had sworn vengeance against this race. The council lasted for hours before the sentence was passed. Then, in the name of the tribal chiefs, Saltese decreed that McLean must be executed immediately. McLean said nothing. Knowing that arguments or pleas for justice or mercy would be useless, he remained still, seemingly indifferent to his fate. With his disinterest, he baffled his captors. When the sentence was passed, he acted like lightning. Wrapping his left arm around Saltese's neck, he drew his revolver and pointed it at the chief. "Revoke this sentence or I will kill you," he shouted, pulling the trigger. "I revoke it," cried Saltese, pale with fear. "I must have your word that I can leave this council safely." "You have my word," replied Saltese quickly. McLean knew how sacred the promise he received under the revolver was. Saltese freed himself from McLean's arm, and McLean exited the tent with the revolver in hand. No one rose against him. He mounted his horse and galloped to his camp, where his 2 companions were ready to jump into the saddle and flee the villages. He owed his life to his mental agility, courage, and good understanding of the Indian character. In 1856, Rufus Choate addressed an audience of 5,000 people in Lowell, Massachusetts, in favor of James Buchanan's presidential candidacy. The floor of the large hall began to sink, gradually collapsing more and more as Choate continued his speech, until a sound of breaking wood below triggered panic, which would have had fatal consequences if it weren't for the calm of B.F. Butler, who was presiding, telling the audience to stay calm. He said he would check if there was cause for alarm. He found that the floor supports were in such bad condition that the slightest applause could bury the audience under the building's rubble. Calmly returning to the podium, he whispered to Choate as he passed, "We'll all be inside in 5 minutes." He then told the crowd that there was no immediate danger if they dispersed slowly. The danger zone, he added, was on the platform, which was very poorly supported. Thus he and those with him would be the last to leave. Undoubtedly, his calmness saved many lives. Many distinguished foreign and American statesmen attended a dinner where wine was served, but Schuyler Colfax, then Vice President of the United States, refused to drink from a glass offered to him. "Colfax doesn't dare to drink," said a senator who had already drunk too much. "You're right," replied the Vice President. "I don't dare." Many years ago, when Grant was in Houston, he received a warm welcome. Naturally hospitable and inclined to appreciate a man of Grant's stature, the people of Houston outdid all other southern cities by offering a banquet and showing their sincerity, friendliness, and hospitality. They made splendid preparations for the dinner, and the committee worked hard to provide the best wines available for the table. That night, when it was time to serve the wine, the server first approached Grant. Without a word, the general quietly lowered all the glasses from his plate. This gesture greatly surprised the Texans, but they rose to the occasion. Without a word, all the men along the long tables also lowered their glasses, and not a drop of wine was drunk that night. At Waterloo, 2 French officers advanced to face a much larger force. One, seeing that the other was showing signs of fear, said, "Sir, I believe you are afraid." "Yes, I am afraid," came the reply, "and if you were half as scared as I am, you would run away." "That is the name of courage," said Wellington when he saw a soldier turn pale as he walked toward a squadron. "He knows his danger and faces it." "There are many cardinals and bishops in Worms," said a friend to Luther, "and they will burn your body to ashes, just as they did with John Hust." Even if they made a fire, that went from Worms to Wittenberg and reached up to the sky. Luther replied, I would walk through it and present myself before them in the name of the Lord. He said to another, I would enter Worms even if there were as many demons as there are tiles on a house. Another man told him, Duke George will surely have you arrested. He replied, That's my duty. I'll go even if it rains for 9 days straight. A recent Western newspaper invited surviving Union and Confederate officers to recount the bravest act they had witnessed during the Civil War. One colonel recounted, At a dinner in Beaufort, South Carolina, where wine flowed freely and obscene jokes ran rampant, Dr. Mayer, a young, slender man who did not drink, was told that he could not leave before offering a toast, telling a story, or singing a song. He replied, I cannot sing, but I will offer a toast even if I have to drink it with water. The men were so moved and embarrassed that they took his hand and thanked him for showing such admirable moral courage. It takes courage for a young man to stand firm while others flatter for praise and power, to wear worn clothes while his peers wear fine garments, to remain honest in poverty while others get rich through fraud, to say no plainly while everyone says yes, to do one's duty in silence and obscurity, while others thrive and become famous, even neglecting their sacred obligations, to reveal one's true self, to show one's imperfections to a world that condemns you, and to be what one truly is. It takes courage and boldness to have people vote against you, to be mocked, ridiculed, misinterpreted, judged wrongly, to be alone with everyone against you. But it is the slaves who do not dare to be truthful with 2 or 3. An honest man is no less worthy because a dog barks at him. We live in fear of being considered ridiculous. It is the coward who proves himself false to his commitments, his masculinity, his honor, for a laugh or a sneer. The young man who starts by being afraid to speak what he thinks will usually end up being afraid to think what he desires. How small we become in the face of our own actions. We live by following the expectations of others, tradition or trends. The doctor or the minister dictates what is expected of us. And we, in turn, do not dare step outside the established norms. Our clothing, our lives, our servants, our carriages, all must conform, or we are condemned to scorn. Who dares manage his personal or business affairs his own way and snap his fingers? It takes courage for a public man not to be dominated by popular prejudice. It takes courage to refuse to follow custom when it is harmful to health and morals. A politician finds it easier to avoid a problem than to stand firm as a man. Just as the strongest man has a weakness somewhere, the greatest hero is a coward about something. Peter was brave enough to draw his sword to defend his master, but he could not bear the ridicule and scorn of the servant girls in the high priest's hall, and he even denied knowing the master for whom he had declared he would die. Do not be like Uriah the Hittite, apologizing to everyone for daring to be in the world. There is nothing attractive about timidity, nothing admirable in fear. Both are deformities and are repellent. Courage is always dignified and graceful. Bruno, condemned to be burned alive in Rome, said to his judge, "You are more afraid to pronounce my sentence than I am to receive it." Tormented to the point of dislocating his bones, he never flinched, but calmly looked at the face of his executioner and refused to renounce his faith. "I thought fear would stop him from going far," said a relative who found young Nelson wandering far from home. "Fear," said the late admiral, "I do not know it. To think something is impossible is to make it impossible. Courage is victory, timidity is defeat. This simple shepherd, David, coming straight from his flock, walking alone and unarmed, except with his shepherd's crook and sling, to face the colossal Goliath in his immense armor, is the most sublime boldness the world has ever seen." "Dent, I would like to know what happens to that hoof," said Grant, when he and Colonel Den were crossing the dense and deadly fire that had forced all their troops to retreat. "I suppose the care of your horse's hoof can wait," Den said. "It would be suicide to stay here." "All right," said Grant. "If you don't want to take care of it, I'll do it." He dismounted, unrolled a piece of wire he had started to cut from the horse's hoof, examined it carefully, and then remounted his horse. "Dent," he said, "when you have a horse you care about, you should never take risks with him. If this wire had been left any longer, he would have gone lame for life, and perhaps ruined forever." Wellington recounted that at Waterloo, the fiercest part of the battle took place around a farm with an orchard surrounded by a thick hedge, which was such a crucial point in the British position that orders were given to defend it at all costs. Eventually the powder and bullets ran out, and the hedges caught fire, surrounding the orchard with a wall of flames. A messenger was sent to fetch ammunition, and soon 2 wagons loaded with supplies galloped toward the farm. The driver of the first vehicle, with the reckless audacity of a young Englishman, urged his horses, struggling and terrified, through the flames. But they rose ferociously around him, catching the powder which exploded in an instant, tearing apart the wagon, horses and driver. For a moment, the driver of the second vehicle stopped, horrified by the fate of his comrade. Then, seeing that the flames, fueled by the explosion, offered him a desperate chance, he sent his horses toward the smoking gap, and amid the cheers of the garrison, safely delivered his cargo inside. Behind him, the flames closed and flared up more fiercely than ever. At the Battle of Friedland, a cannonball passed over the heads of the French soldiers, and a young soldier instinctively dodged it. Napoleon looked at him and smiled, saying, "My friend, if that bullet was meant for you, even if you buried yourself 100 meters underground, I would find you there." When the mine was placed in front of Petersburg, the fuse was lit, and the Union troops prepared to attack the enemy installations as soon as the explosion created a breach. But seconds, minutes, and hours passed without the mine making a sound, making the weight unbearable. Lieutenant Dowdy and Sergeant Rez volunteered to examine the fuse. They silently crossed the long underground galleries, unaware that they were walking toward a horrific death. They found the fault, rearmed the fuse, and soon a terrible upheaval of earth signaled the march toward victory. At the Battle of Copenhagen, while Nelson walked on the slippery, blood-covered deck, surrounded by the dead, he said, "This is hot work, and this day may be the last for one of us, but look, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else, even if I were paid a fortune." At the Battle of Trafalgar, when he was struck by a bullet and brought to the ground, his face was covered so the fighters would not know their leader had fallen. During a skirmish at Salamanca, while enemy cannons were firing on his regiment, Sir William Napier's men became disobedient. Napier immediately ordered them to stop and had 4 of the ringleaders flogged under fire. The men immediately surrendered and then marched 5 kilometers under intense bombardment with the same coldness as if it were a scene from a movie. Execute your plans immediately. Thoughts are only dreams until they show their impact. They are not opponents, but human beings. Conquer your place in the world, for all things benefit a brave soul. Face difficulties with bravery, endure adversity with courage, accept poverty with nobility, and confront disappointment with boldness. The influence of the brave man is contagious and creates an epidemic of courage among all those around him. Every day men are sent to the grave simply because they stayed in the dark, their shyness having prevented them from even trying. And had they been motivated to start, they likely would have succeeded. "No great accomplishment is achieved," said George Eliot, "by those who hesitate and seek certainty." Once the great inner struggle was over and Thomas More decided to stay true to his principles, he cheerfully walked to his cell. His wife called him a fool for choosing to remain in a dark, damp and dirty prison while he could have gained freedom simply by renouncing his doctrines, as some bishops had done. But Thomas More preferred death to shame. His daughter showed the power of love to banish fear and remained faithful to her father when everyone, including her mother, had abandoned him. After he was beheaded and his head exposed on a pole on London Bridge, the poor daughter begged the authorities to be buried in the same coffin as him. Her request was granted, and her death soon followed. When Sir Walter Raleigh went to the scaffold, he was very weakened and began his speech to the crowd by saying that, during the last 2 days, he had suffered from 2 severe attacks. "If you perceive any weakness in me, I beg you to attribute it to my illness and not to myself." He took the axe, kissed the blade, and said to the sheriff, "It's a powerful medicine, but a good remedy for all ailments. Do not waste time dreaming of obstacles you may never encounter, or crossing bridges you have not yet reached. Having only half the will and always living on a tightrope is losing control of your life." Abraham Lincoln's childhood was a long struggle against poverty, with little education and no influential friends. When he finally began practicing law, he needed a lot of courage to try his luck in the weakest political camp, thus jeopardizing the little reputation he had gained. Only the most sublime moral courage could support him as president, to stay firm in the face of hostile criticism and a long series of disasters, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and to support Grant and Stanton against the outcries of politicians and the press. Lincoln never hesitated to defend an unpopular cause when he believed it was the right thing to do. At a time when a young lawyer almost risked losing his daily bread by defending a fugitive slave, and when other lawyers had refused, Lincoln defended the cause of the unfortunate whenever the opportunity arose. "Go see Lincoln," they would say to the pursued fugitives seeking protection. He feared no cause if it was just. Thus, to align oneself with the truth is noble when we share its tough bark. When its cause brings glory and profit, and it is prosperous to be just, the brave man chooses, while the coward stands on the sidelines, hesitating in his abject mind until his Lord is crucified. When Solomon Chase left the courtroom after a passionate argument in favor of the fugitive slave Matilda, a man looked at him with astonishment and said, "Here is a young man who has just ruined himself." But in ruining himself, Chase had taken the first important step in a career that would lead him to become Governor of Ohio, Senator, Secretary of the Treasury, and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In the trial of William Penn for speaking at a difficult council meeting, the clerk, dissatisfied with the first verdict, said to the jury, "We will have a verdict with the help of God, or you will die of hunger for this. You are Englishmen. Tell them to keep their privileges. Do not renounce your rights." Finally, after 2 days and 2 nights without food, the jury returned a not guilty verdict. The secretary fined them 40 German pounds each for their independence. What did the mockery of the crowd matter to him? The paralyzed hand moved, the blind saw, the leper was healed, the dead spoke, despite the sarcasm and mockery of the spectators. What did the rotten eggs and contempt of others matter? Finally, the arrogant world had found its equal. The Vickery Golds had to be silenced by the harsh English graves that came to extinguish them. They did not stand firm and forced thousands of people to listen and pay attention. Anna Dickinson left the platform when Molly Maguire's bullets flew over her head. She silenced those pistols with her courage and arguments. What the world wants is a Knox who dares to preach with a musket pointed at his head, a Garrison who is not afraid of prison, the crowd, or the scaffold raised before his door. When General Butler was sent with 9,000 men to quell the riots in New York, he arrived ahead of his troops and found the streets crowded with an enraged mob that had already hanged several men from lampposts. Without waiting for his men, Butler made his way to where the crowd was thickest, overturned a barrel of ashes, climbed on top, and began his speech. The demons of 5 Points had murdered their superiors, and the bloody crowd trembled before the courageous words of a single man in a city that Mayor Fernando Wood could not control with the help of the police and militia. "Our enemies are before us," cried the Spartans at Thermopylae, "and we are before them," was Leonidas's cold response. "Drop your weapons or the message from Xerxes." "Come and take them," replied Leonidas. A Persian soldier said, "You will not be able to see the sun because of the javelins and arrows flying." "Then we will fight in the shade," replied Leonidas. It is not surprising that a small group of men halted the advance of the greatest army ever assembled. "That's impossible," said a staff officer when Napoleon gave instructions for an audacious plan. "Impossible," replied the great commander. "Impossible is the adjective of fools. The courageous man is an example for the fearless. His influence is magnetic. Men follow him even to death. Men who have shown courage have often changed the world, often before reaching maturity. It is astonishing to see what boldness and perseverance accomplished during youth. Alexander, who ascended the throne at 20, had conquered the world by the time he died at 33. Julius Caesar captured 800 cities, conquered 300 nations, challenged 3 million men, became a great orator and one of the greatest statesmen, and he was still young. Washington was appointed aide-de-camp at 19, sent as an ambassador at 21 to negotiate with the French, and won his first battle as a colonel at 22. Lafayette was appointed general of the entire French army at 20. Charlemagne ruled France and Germany at 30. Galileo was only 18 when he discovered the principle of the pendulum by observing the swinging lamp in the Pisa Cathedral. Pitt was in Parliament at 21, Blackstone was in Parliament before the age of 22, and at 24 he was Lord of the Treasury. Elizabeth Barrett Browning mastered Greek and Latin at 12, and Robert Browning received meaningful poems at 11. Cooley, who rests in Westminster Abbey, published a poetry collection at 15. Luther was only 29 when he nailed his famous thesis to the church door and challenged the Pope. Nelson was a lieutenant in the British Navy before he was 20, and he was 47 when he received his mortal wound at Trafalgar. At 36, Cortés was the conqueror of Mexico. Clive had established British power in India. Hannibal, the greatest of military commanders, was only 30 when he inflicted a nearly annihilating blow to the Roman Republic at Cannae, and Napoleon was only 27 when he overcame and defeated the veteran Austrian marshals on the plains of Italy. Men who have surpassed the limits of life consistently demonstrate their courage and determination. Victor Hugo and Wellington were at the peak of their lives after reaching 60. Blackstone governed England with a firm hand at 84 and was a model of literary and scholarly ability. Shakespeare says that the one who flees the hive is not worthy of the honey, for bees have stingers. The courageous man is not one who does not feel fear, for that would be foolish and irrational, but one whose noble soul masters his fear and dares bravely to face the danger that nature avoids. Many brilliant young men have accomplished nothing of value for themselves or the world simply because they did not dare to start. Begin. Begin regardless of what people think of you. Do what you believe is right. Be indifferent to both censure and praise. I venture to do all that a man can do. He who dares more is no one, said Shakespeare. Great actions are realized in minor struggles. There are stubborn and unknown courageous men who defend themselves inch by inch in the shadows against the fatal invasion of misery and baseness. Noble and mysterious triumphs which neither youth, fame, nor any flourish of trumpet salute are life, misery, isolation, abandonment, and poverty. These are battlefields that have their heroes. Victor Hugo said, "Fight like men." 1 Samuel 4:9. The will and the way, I will find a way or make a way. Nothing is impossible for the man who has will. Look, I see that the firm will of a great heart will make 1,000 tremble. A weak dwarf, fearless and determined, will change the course of battle and gather for a nobler struggle the giants who have fled. In the lexicon of youth, destiny reserves for brilliant maturity. There is no such word as failure. When one recognizes a firm and determined mind, it is curious to see how a man's environment clears away and leaves him space and freedom. John Foster, just like the Prince of Orange can tear the stars from the sky, can also bring the ocean to the walls of Leiden. For their relief, the Spanish soldiers mocked when they were told that the Dutch fleet would raise this terrible 4-meter siege in 1574. However, from the dry lips of William, twisting in his fevered bed in Rotterdam, came the order, "Break the dikes, return the Netherlands to the ocean." Then the people responded, "Better a drowned land than a lost one." They began demolishing dike after dike of strongholds, lining them up one after the other for 24 kilometers all the way into their city. It was a huge task. The garrison was starving, and the besiegers mocked the slow progress of the insects who claimed to govern the waves of the sea. But as in the past, heaven helps those who help themselves. On October 1st and 2nd, a violent storm drove the ocean inland and carried the fleet by the rising waters almost to the camp of the Spaniards. The next morning the garrison emerged to attack their enemies, but the besiegers had fled, terrified by the darkness. The next day the wind changed and a storm shook the water with the fleet upon it. From the surface of the Netherlands, the outer dikes were immediately replaced, leaving the North Sea within its previous boundaries. When the flowers bloomed the following spring, a joyful procession marched through the streets to establish Leiden University in commemoration of the city's miraculous liberation. At a dinner given in 1837 at Chancellor Kent's residence in New York, some of the most distinguished men of the country were invited, among them a young Frenchman who seemed rather melancholic and evasive. Professor Morse was also among the guests, and during the evening he drew the attention of Mr. Gallatin, then a prominent statesman, to the unknown. Observing that his forehead indicated great intellect, Mr. Gallatin replied, touching his forehead with his finger, "There is much in his head, but he has a strange fancy. Can you believe it? He has the idea that one day he will be Emperor of France. Can you conceive of something more absurd?" It seemed absurd because this reserved Frenchman was then a poor adventurer, an exile from his country, with no fortune or powerful connections. And yet, 14 years later, his idea came true. His dream of becoming Napoleon III became a reality. Certainly, before reaching his goal, he spent long and gloomy years of prison, exile, disaster, perseverance, and hope. But in the end, he succeeded in achieving his ambition. He was not scrupulous about the means used to achieve his ends, but he is a remarkable example of what courage and energy can accomplish. When Mr. Ingram, editor of the Illustrated London News, began his life as a newspaper vendor in Nottingham, England, he walked 16 kilometers to deliver a single newspaper before disappointing a customer. Could anyone be surprised that a young man like him succeeded? Once he woke up at 2 a.m. and walked to London to get newspapers because there was no mail to bring them. He was determined not to deceive his clients. This is the kind of will that finds a way. There is nothing more magnificent than the words of young Henry Fawcett, the last general postmaster under Gladstone, to his despairing father, who had lost both his eyes to birdshot during a hunting accident. "It doesn't matter, father. Blindness will not hinder my success in life." One of the most moving sights in the streets of London, many years later, was Henry Fawcett, now a Member of Parliament, being driven everywhere by a faithful daughter who served as secretary and guide to her courageous father. Imagine a young man, barely on the threshold of active life, suddenly losing sight in both eyes, and yet, through incomprehensible courage and tenacity, rising to prominence in all fields, not to mention becoming one of the most distinguished men in his country. The courageous daughter, who was the eyes of her father, was herself a wonderful example of courage and determination. For the first time in the history of Oxford College, which dates back centuries, a woman succeeded in obtaining the position of principal regent, a post that had previously only been held by great men such as Gladstone. This achievement had not been equaled in history up to that point and attracted the attention of the civilized world. Not only had no woman held this post before, but with few exceptions, only men who became highly distinguished had held it. Circumstances, as Milton says, have rarely favored famous men. They have actually paved their way to triumph through all kinds of obstacles. The true way to conquer circumstances is to become a greater circumstance yourself. However, while we want to emphasize as strongly as possible that strength of will is necessary for success, and that, all things being equal, the stronger the will, the greater and more complete the success, we cannot support the theory that there is nothing in circumstances or environment, or that any man, simply because he has indomitable will, can become a Bonaparte, a Pitt, a Webster, a Bismarck, or a Lincoln. We must temper determination with discretion and support it with knowledge and common sense, or it will only lead us to crash against a wall. We should not expect to overcome an obstacle with stubborn will alone. We only have the right to assume that we can do anything within the limits of our greatest ability, strength, and endurance. Obstacles that cannot be overcome hinder our progress in certain directions, but in any direction we attempt to take, we will find that, as a rule, either they are not insurmountable or they are not permanent. A man of strong will, intelligence, and perseverance will find or open a way where, by the nature of things, it is possible to find or open a way. Every student knows that circumstances provide clients for lawyers and patients for doctors, place ordinary clerks on extraordinary desks, place the children of the rich at the heads of immense corporations and large houses when they have very limited ability and barely any experience, while poor young people with exceptional ability, a good education, good character, and experience often have to struggle for years to obtain even mediocre positions. There are thousands of young men with superior competence, both in cities and in the countryside, who seem doomed to remain in ordinary positions with small wages, while others are promoted by money or family influence to desirable positions. In other words, we all know that the best men do not always get the best positions. Circumstances have a great deal to do with our position and salary. Everyone knows that will is not always on the way, that work does not always conquer all things, that some things are impossible even for those who desire them, no matter how strong they are. One cannot always make of oneself what one wants, that there are limitations in our own nature that nothing can overcome. However, although it is true that strength of will cannot perform miracles, all of history shows that it is almost omnipotent and can perform wonders. As Shakespeare says, men are at some point the masters of their destinies. The fault, dear brute, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are their subordinates. Show me a man who, according to popular prejudice, is a victim of bad luck, and I will show you someone who has an unfortunate change of temperament that invites disaster. He's in a bad mood, vain or insignificant. He lacks character, enthusiasm, or other qualities necessary for success. The Israeli said that man is not the creature of circumstances, but that circumstances are the creatures of men. He believes in the power of will that crushes the morbid and sentimental doctrine of fatalism. You must, but you cannot, you must, but it is not possible. Give me the man who faces what he must, who surpasses the limits imposed by his birth and seizes the skirts of lucky chance, who endures the blows of circumstance and fights against his bad fortune. Indomitable will and unwavering purpose will find a way or open one. There is always room for a strong man. He who has a firm will, says Goethe, shapes the world to his measure. People do not lack strength, says Victor Hugo, they lack will. He who sets himself a great goal overcomes the barriers that oppose him, and he who adopts the great idea of self-knowledge and engages in it seriously will find this idea and commitment burning within him like a fire, always pushing him toward his personal development. He will find them by eliminating difficulties, seeking or creating means, finding courage in the face of discouragement and strength in the face of weakness. Almost all great men who have surpassed their peers have shone especially through their energy of will. A contemporary said of Julius Caesar that it was his unflinching energy and gigantic determination, more than his military skill, that earned him his victories. The young man who begins life determined to make the best use of his eyes and who exploits everything for his own progress, who keeps his ears attentive to any sound that might help him on his way, who keeps his hands open to seize any opportunity, who is always alert to anything that can help him progress in the world, who makes use of every life experience and turns it into paint for the great picture of his life, who keeps his heart open to inspiration, this young man will surely be certain that his life will be a success. Without a doubt, if you have health, nothing can stop you from succeeding. No dictatorship of circumstances can permanently imprison a determined will. The world always makes way for the determined man. The general of a great army may be defeated, said Confucius, but the resolute thought of a peasant cannot be defeated. A poor blind beggar who repaired shoes in a charity house and became the greatest biblical scholar wrote in his journal, "I do not believe in impossibilities. I think that all the beautiful stories about natural talent are simply rhetoric, and that any man can, depending on his opportunities and determination, become almost anything he desires." Lincoln is probably the most remarkable example in history showing the possibilities of our country. Despite the poverty he was born into, the turmoil of a frontier village, the discouragement of an early bankruptcy, and the fluctuations of popular politics, he rose as a defender of the Union and freedom. Lincoln's will found its way when his friends nominated him for the legislature. His enemies mocked him when he gave campaign speeches, wearing a coat too short to sit in, linen trousers, straw hats, and metal boots. He had only character and friends. When his friends suggested he become a lawyer, he mocked the idea, saying he did not have enough brains. He studied law barefoot under the trees, his neighbors said, and sometimes slept on the counter of the shop where he worked. He had to borrow money to buy a suit to look respectable in the legislature, and walked 160 kilometers to take his seat in Vandalia. See Turlewid defying poverty and walking 3 kilometers in the snow with worn-out shoes to borrow a book and read it by the bushfire. See him living on bread and water in a Dutch attic. See Jane sleeping many nights on the floor of a barn with only a book as a pillow. See Samuel Trio adjusting his apron string instead of having dinner. History is full of examples like these. The one who pays the price of victory should never fear final defeat. Paris was in the hands of a crowd. The authorities, in a panic, did not dare trust their subordinates. A man arrived and said, "I know a young officer who has the courage and skill to control this crowd." "Let him come," they said. They sent for Napoleon. He came, subdued the crowd, then the authorities, governed France, and then conquered Europe. Success in life largely depends on the strength of will, and anything that weakens it or dims it reduces success. Will can be educated. What transforms most easily into habit in us is will. That is why learn to will with decision and strength, so that your floating life is anchored and does not drift here and there like a dead leaf carried by every wind that blows. It is not talent that men lack, but the will to work. The goal was that insatiable thirst for knowledge that kept John Lydon, son of a Scottish pastor, going despite poverty and discouragement. Barefoot and alone, he walked 6 or 8 miles a day to learn to read, which was all his education. His desire to receive training defied extreme poverty. No obstacle could divert him from his goal. He felt rich when he discovered a small bookstore, and his thirsty soul would drink in for hours from the precious treasures of its invaluable volumes, without caring about the meager bread and water food awaiting him in his humble home. Nothing could deter him from his desire to improve his situation through study. It seemed to him that access to books and lectures was all a man needed. Before he was 19, this poor pastor with no opportunities had astonished the professors of Edinburgh with his knowledge of Greek and Latin. When he learned that they needed a surgeon's assistant in the public administration, though he knew nothing of medicine, he decided to apply. Only 6 months remained before the position would be filled, but nothing intimidated him, and he graduated with distinction. Walter Scott, who thought this was one of the most remarkable examples of perseverance, helped him prepare, and he sailed for India. Webster was very poor, even after entering Dartmouth College. A friend sent him a recipe to grease his boots. Webster wrote to thank him and added, "My boots need another doctorate, for they not only let in water but also peas and gravel stones." However, he became one of the greatest men in the world. Sidney Smith said that Webster was a living lie because no man on earth could be as great as he seemed. He said of him that one would be inclined to support him against the world at first sight. What seemed like luck, if I was Stephen, his whole life, whatever he did, always seemed to benefit others, being foreign, not speaking English, corpulent with an unpleasant face, blind in one eye. He found it difficult to start. However, he did not give up easily. He had started as a sailor at 13 and sailed for 9 years between Bordeaux and the French Antilles. He took advantage of every free moment at sea to improve his skills, mastering the art of navigation. At the age of 8, he discovered that he was blind in one eye. His father, apparently thinking he would never succeed, did not help him receive an education beyond reading and writing, but sent his younger brothers to university. The discovery of his blindness, his father's neglect, and the discontent with his brother's progress added to his stubbornness throughout his life. When he began to work for himself in Philadelphia, he seemed to avoid nothing for money. He bought and sold everything, from food to used items, bottled wine and cider, making good profits. Everything he touched prospered. He left nothing to chance. His plans and projects were made with mathematical care. The letters he wrote to his captains in foreign ports, where he mapped his routes and gave detailed instructions, are models of foresight and systematic planning. He never left anything important in the hands of others. He was very precise in his instructions and did not allow the slightest deviation. He often said that while his captains might save him money, if they deviated from the instructions even once, they would cause him losses in 99 other cases. He never lost a ship, and often what caused the financial ruin of many others, like the War of 1812, only served to increase his wealth. Everyone, especially his jealous merchant brothers, attributed his great success to luck, even though he was undeniably lucky to be in the right place at the right time. What seemed like luck was actually his good judgment and promptness in seizing opportunities, as well as his effort to make the most of things. The mathematician will tell you that when you roll the dice, there are 30 chances to roll a certain number, and if you find a way to repeat the same roll 3 times in a row and so on, in increasingly greater proportions, many young people who have read the story of John Wanamaker's romantic career have gained little inspiration or help for their own development and progress, seeing it as the result of good luck and the whims of fate. What a lucky guy, they say to themselves while reading. How prosperous he was. However, a meticulous analysis of Wanamaker's life only reinforces the same lesson taught by the analysis of most great lives, namely that a good mother, good health, the habit of hard work, indomitable energy, a determination that knows no defeat, unwavering decision, a focus that never scatters its forces, self-control that can say no and stick to it, total integrity, real honesty, a good disposition, enthusiasm for a vocation, a clear goal, and a noble purpose guarantee a high level of success. It should be taught to the youth that circumstances influence our lives, that there are cases where a poor pedestrian encounters no obstacle in his path and reaches the goal, just as another more capable person crosses a crowded bridge, a blocked street, and does not win the race. That wealth often places sons in high positions unfairly. That family influence provides clients for a lawyer, patients for a doctor, a good chair for an ordinary scholar. But that, on the other hand, positions, clients, chairs, and director and supervisor posts do not necessarily constitute success. It should be pointed out that, ultimately, as a general rule, the best man gets the best position and lasting merit triumphs. There is as much chance that idleness and incapacity will achieve real success or a higher position in life as there is to produce a lost paradise by shaking the words from the Webster Dictionary and letting them fall randomly to the floor. Fortune smiles upon those who make an effort and work, upon men who are not afraid of monotonous and tiring work, upon men of courage and bravery who are not discouraged by dirt and trivialities. Youth should be taught that one is great only by living a heroic life against fate, that diligence is the mother of good fortune, and that 9 times out of 10, what we call luck or destiny is nothing but a simple bug for the indolent, the lazy, the discouraged, the negligent, the indifferent. As a general rule, the man who fails does not see or seize his opportunity. Opportunity is shy, it is quick, it leaves before the slow or negligent can take advantage of it with idle desires. Stupid people remain inactive. If there is will, wisdom finds the way. It has been very well said that the reputation of being a person of strong, courageous, and unyielding willpower is of great and invaluable worth. It often overcomes enemies and dispels opposition to one's plans from the very beginning, which would otherwise be formidable. It is surprising to see what men, who were slow to reason, have succeeded in accomplishing by making a sudden decision. Art Wright was 50 when he began to learn English grammar and improve his writing and spelling. Benjamin Franklin was over 50 when he began studying sciences and philosophy. Milton, in his blindness, was over 50 when he sat down to complete his world-renowned epic, and Scott, at 55, took up the pen to settle a $600,000 debt. "I continue to learn," said Michelangelo when he was over 60 and had reached the highest peaks of his art. "Even the brain is less important than the will. The man who doubts is always left out of the race of life. Only the weak and hesitant are stopped by adverse circumstances and obstacles. A man with an iron will, with the determination to let nothing stop his career, is sure to succeed if he has perseverance and audacity. Perhaps we don't find the time for what we would like, but what we desire and strive for with all our might, we often have the luck to come close to, if not fully achieve it. It would be desirable to show the youth of America the great role that willpower can play in their journey, success, and also their happiness. The achievements of willpower are simply immeasurable. Little seems impossible for a man who possesses strong and persevering willpower. We often see an example of this in the case of a young woman who suddenly realizes her simplicity and unattractive appearance, but who, with a heroic effort of willpower and hard work, manages to improve her appearance and rise to an important position, overcoming what mere appearance could not have offered her. Charlotte, with no physical charm, reached the heights of her profession. How many young people tormented by their unattractive appearance or mental deficiencies have overcome mediocrity and risen above those who despised them through persistent exercise of willpower? History is full of examples of men and women who have risen from misery and poverty through an iron will. Being aware of being considered inferior, incapable of achieving what others succeed at, being considered ignorant at school, has pushed many young people to a determination that has lifted them far above those who mocked them, as in the case of Newton, Adam Clark, Sheridan, Wellington, Goldsmith, Dr. Chalmers, Curran, Israeli, and hundreds of others. These are men like Mira who trample on impossibilities, like Napoleon who does not wait for opportunities but creates them, like Grant who only demands unconditional surrender from the enemy. Those who change the course of the world cannot say that it is impossible, declared a frustrated lieutenant to Alexander. "Go away," shouted the Macedonian conqueror. "There is nothing impossible for the one who tries." If I were asked to say in one word the secret of the many failures of those who started life with great hopes, I would say without hesitation that they lacked willpower. They didn't even have half the will. A man without will is like a locomotive without steam, a simple game of chance going here and there, always at the mercy of those who have it. I would say that willpower is the test of the possibilities of a young person. He may have a will strong enough to maintain his commitment with iron determination. It is this iron endurance that gives a strong presence in life. True wisdom, said Napoleon, is a resolute determination, an iron will. Without values, this could lead to a Napoleon, but with character it would produce someone like Wellington or Grant, without the stain of ambition or greed.